So we wrote that the autonomic nervous system, and most of the books will refer to the autonomic motor neurons as the autonomic nervous system. And they usually have that contained in a separate chapter. I don't really like the term autonomic nervous system because it almost suggests that we've got your nervous system and then we've got the autonomic nervous system. It's all one nervous system, but that's just the way they refer to it. It does consist of the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus is regarded as the highest control center over the autonomic motor neurons that affect the activity of our visceral organs, of our internal organs. We've talked about that before. You'd say, when? Well, let me just remind you. Let's look on the very last, page 108. Page 108. Yeah, we wrote it last time. The hypothalamus, we wrote as the highest control center over the internal organs, over the autonomic motor neurons that affect the internal organs. So just reminding you of that. That was page 108. All right, so back where we were. So this so-called autonomic nervous system consists of the hypothalamus of the brain, which is the center of homeostasis, descending. What does descending mean? Going down. All right, descending autonomic fiber tracts and autonomic motor neurons. And we wrote that the hypothalamus, right, your center of homeostasis, is continuously and unconsciously, without you being aware of what's going on, adjusting the activity of your visceral effectors. I don't know what an effector is. We learned that term a long time ago in section C. It means organs that produce an effect. All right, visceral organs, internal organs. So the hypothalamus is continuously fine-tuning, speeding up and slowing down the rate of activity of these visceral organs to match your physical activity and energy requirements. So in other words, what happens to your heart rate when you're, go to sleep? It slows down. What happens to your heart rate if you start walking or running? It speeds up. This is all working automatically. You don't think about it. You don't say, let's say I'm walking now, I better make my heart speed up. Like, it just does it. It does it automatically. Your hypothalamus is dealing with all this and other parts of our brain. Now, we did write. Oh, darn. Okay, well, it didn't work. It didn't work the other day. Here's what I was trying to do. Now it would have worked. Yeah. I know, they're thinking he's flipped. All right. What I was trying to do was to frighten you. Because if I had frightened you, what do you think would have happened to your heart rate? It would have gone up. So the point that we're making here is your hypothalamus is influenced by your emotional state. Because the hypothalamus is wired into your limbic system, the center of emotions. Again, we talked about this last time. Again, on page 108. How do I know I talked about it last time? Because it's still there. The limbic system is the center of emotions, and it can influence the hypothalamus, which is the highest control center over the internal organs. So therefore, your emotions can affect your hypothalamus, which in turn can affect your guts, your internal organs, your heart rate, GI motility, salivation, and so on. All right, so much for page 95. Let's look on 96. So on page 96, so here it shows where the hypothalamus is. You remember, it's the area of the brain right above the pituitary gland. And it reminds us that its hypothalamus is wired into the limbic system, which is associated with emotions. So it's simply pointing out emotions can affect the hypothalamus, as we've just pointed out. And then there are various descending tracts. Not only, just as there were corticospinal or pyramidal tracts that affect somatic motor neurons, there are descending autonomic tracts that affect autonomic motor neurons. Branching off the brain and spinal cord, are autonomic motor neurons that innervate various internal organs. The heart, as pictured here, the stomach, the salivary glands, and so on. Now, below the picture, we wrote that there's actually two types of autonomic motor neurons. What are these two types called? Parasympathetic and sympathetic autonomic motor neurons. Now, in general, there's a parasympathetic and sympathetic autonomic motor neuron going to every internal organ. So because all of these internal organs are innervated by both two types of autonomic motor neurons, a parasympathetic and a sympathetic, we call that dual innervation. Dual means double innervation. Now, why is there two types? What's the difference between them? The parasympathetic autonomic motor neurons exert the predominant influence on your visceral organs during states of quiet relaxation. So right now you're more or less relaxed, and your parasympathetic autonomic motor neurons are exerting the dominant influence when you have low energy requirements. But it's not going to work when Jack's watching me. See, anyhow, Perry was watching me. Everybody's watching. Okay, so you weren't watching. I might have gotten a rip. Okay, but during stress is when the sympathetic autonomic motor neurons are activated. So they are activated and they exert the dominant influence during states of stress. Now it's easy to remember. Sympathetic starts with the letter S, like the word stress starts with the letter S. So the sympathetics are activated during stress states, the parasympathetics when you're not stressed, in the relaxed state. Now, as we're going to see, why you have a parasympathetic and sympathetic that are activated, one during stress and one when you're relaxed, is that these two types of autonomic motor neurons act like accelerator pedals and brake pedals on your internal organs. So in other words, we're going to see, going to your heart, there's a parasympathetic that in effect actually acts like a brake pedal on your heart, and a sympathetic that acts like an accelerator pedal on your heart. So we basically, through these two types of autonomic motor neurons, your brain can speed up or slow down the rate of activity of any internal organ of your body. Now, how do we define stress? Okay, you say, well, I know stress when I see it. Well, we can more formally define it. In the 1940s, a very famous Austrian physiologist named Hans Selye defined stress by 3 F's. Some people say there's 4 F's. But anyhow, there's fight, fright, and flight. What is stress? When you're fighting. Now, you could be in a boxing ring and actually fighting somebody. You could be in combat. That would be stressful. You're fighting. You're the enemy. You could just be competing with somebody. In other words, when you come in to take a physiology exam and you really want to do well, you are fighting. You are competing. If you were playing a game of poker and you had $500 at stake on whether you're going to win that hand of poker, believe me, you would be stressed in fighting to win. Fright. So that's what I was going to try to do, unsuccessfully as it turned out. But when you're frightened, that's stressful. All of these F states are associated with increased demands for energy and flight. What does flight mean? You're running. And whether you are actually running, you're exercising, you're on a treadmill, or even if you're emotionally running. You'd say, what do you mean I'm emotionally running? Let's imagine, I'm sure this has happened, you have to get to LAX, and you've got to catch a flight.
That's me tonight.
Tonight. Okay. What time's your flight?
11. I have a class till 8 though.
Okay. Here's what if your flight was like in an hour?
That would leave now.
All right? Because the San Diego freeway is the world's largest parking lot right now. You ever been on the San Diego freeway right now? It's moving 12 miles an hour. And they keep opening up more lanes, and it doesn't help. All right? So you're looking at the watch, and you know you've got to get to the LAX, and you're moving 12 miles an hour. And your body, emotionally, you just want to get out of the car. You figure you can run faster than you are driving there, right? Your body is emotionally in flight, but you're going nowhere. So all of these are associated with high energy requirements. All right, now, on page 97, so we've talked about how our internal organs have this dual or double innervation. What I want to now look at is the anatomy of how the parasympathetic autonomic motor neurons, how they innervate our internal organs. We'll first look at the parasympathetics, and then we'll look at the sympathetic autonomic motor neurons and how they innervate our internal organs. Now, what this picture shows on page 97 is it indicates which nerves coming off the central nervous system. This is the central nervous system. So what's that? That's the brain and spinal cord. Which nerves coming off the central nervous system contain parasympathetic autonomic motor neurons? According to this diagram, some of the cranial nerves contain parasympathetics, and way down at the bottom of the spinal cord, some of the spinal nerves coming off at the sacral level of the spinal cord. Some of these sacral spinal nerves contain parasympathetic autonomic motor neurons. So what are we saying? Some of the cranial nerves and some of these sacral spinal nerves. Those are the only nerves where inside them there are, among other things, parasympathetic autonomic motor neurons. That's why, it's for that reason, that the parasympathetic division is also called the Cranio-Sacral, because it is associated with some of the cranial nerves and some of the sacral spinal nerves. Now, who are these cranial nerves? Cranial nerves number 3, 7, 9, and most importantly, number 10, the vagus. And then there's some of these spinal nerves coming off way at the bottom at the sacral level. Now, let's remind you of who these cranial nerves are, 3 and 7 and 9 and 10. If you look on the next page, 98. So on page 98, so cranial nerve number 3 is the oculomotor, cranial nerve number 7 is the facial, cranial nerve number 9 is the glossopharyngeal. Very importantly, 3 stars, the vagus nerve is number 10. And then there's these sacral spinal nerves, sometimes called the pelvic nerves. Let me have you do something. Let's look back on page 72 when we were learning about cranial nerves. So let's take a look at page 72. I'll see if I can find my page 72. Way back on page 72, that's not that far back, this is our cranial nerve chart. Now we learned, when we're reviewing the cranial nerves, we told you which cranial nerves contain sensory, somatic sensory neurons, or visceral sensory neurons, or somatic motor neurons, or autonomic motor neurons. Remember that? So for example, the olfactory cranial nerves contain only somatic sensory associated with the sense of smell. Now you'll notice the cranial nerve number 3, the oculomotor, has somatic motor neurons and autonomic motor. Look at what I wrote right above autonomic motor, parasympathetic. I didn't say that, I did not highlight it at the time, but it was there. So let's look at cranial nerve number 7. Cranial nerve number 7 contains somatic sensory, somatic motor, and autonomic motor. What type of autonomic motor? Parasympathetic. In fact, every cranial nerve that has autonomic motor listed, you will see it says parasympathetic autonomic motor. Now, the most important of these cranial nerves in terms of autonomic motor, specifically parasympathetic autonomic motor, is the vagus. So it provides parasympathetic autonomic motor neurons to all of the internal organs in your chest and abdomen. And so all the autonomic motor neurons contained inside the cranial nerves are parasympathetic, because parasympathetic is also called Cranio-Sacral. I'm just reminding you that. All right, now on page 98, there's another chart, another picture. This picture is showing which nerves coming off the central nervous system contain the sympathetic autonomic motor neuron. This is page 98. Now, according to this picture, the only nerves that contain inside them sympathetic autonomic motor neurons are those spinal nerves coming off at the thoracic and lumbar levels. So these are showing spinal nerves coming off at the thoracic and lumbar levels of the spinal cord. Those are the only nerves coming off the central nervous system that have sympathetic. That's why the sympathetics are also known as the thoraco-lumbar division. So there is an anatomic dichotomy. There is clearly a difference anatomically. Now, what's interesting is that these sympathetic autonomic motor neurons that come off at the thoracic and lumbar levels end up innervating these very same visceral organs that on the previous page, the parasympathetics innervated. So the parasympathetics, especially most importantly the vagus, contain parasympathetics that go out to these internal organs, and the sympathetics go out to the very same internal organs. In other words, these internal organs are innervated by two types, parasympathetic and sympathetic autonomic motor neurons. That's called dual innervation. Now, there is a composite picture on page 99. On page 99, this is the picture that's usually found in every anatomy book, every physiology book, every medical, surgical, nursing book. This is a composite drawing showing you the visceral organs on your right. Right? Everything from the iris of the eye. This is pointing to the iris of the eye. To the lacrimal or tear glands, to these mucus-secreting glands, the salivary glands, the heart, the airways of the lungs, the stomach, the spleen, the adrenal glands, the kidneys, the small intestine, the large intestine, the urinary bladder, and you'll notice that they have, in this composite drawing, dual innervation. For example, you'll notice to the heart, it shows two lines going to the heart. One of them is a parasympathetic, the other is a sympathetic. Look at the iris of the eye, two lines going to the iris. One's a parasympathetic, the other is a sympathetic. So there's a dual innervation to these structures. All right, now let's look at page 101. Before I say anything more about the autonomic motor neurons, I want to review our old friends, the somatic motor neurons. Now this is going to be really easy, because we've been talking about the somatic motor neurons, which control skeletal muscles, quite extensively for the last few weeks. So this is going to be real simple. The somatic motor neurons, we know, generally originate in the ventral gray horns of the spinal cord. The somatic motor neuron... You say, did you write that? Yeah, it's written right here. You'd say, just checking. All right, so we have learned this before, back on page 52 and 65. And these somatic motor neurons are always myelinated, and they extend out inside the spinal nerves and in some of the cranial nerves. And they synapse onto a group of skeletal muscle cells, or skeletal muscle fibers. And we know the somatic motor neuron and all the skeletal muscle cells it controls is called a motor unit. Now, we have learned that when the somatic motor neuron sends an action potential, an AP, along its length, when it reaches, the action potential reaches the synaptic knobs, it releases what neurotransmitter? Acetylcholine. Right? This seems really easy now. Any neuron that releases acetylcholine is called a cholinergic neuron. That's the term we use. It's cholinergic because it releases acetylcholine. So somatic motor neuron is a cholinergic neuron. Now, we have learned that when the acetylcholine is released, it attaches and activates what we call nicotinic acetylcholine receptor sites. Does that ring a bell? Anybody remember that? If it doesn't, we covered it. You'd say, well, I don't think so. When did we ever cover that? Let's see if I can find the page. Find the page here. Someplace, I don't know. This is when we went into great detail about the synapse at the neuromuscular junction. And I won't take the time right now, but if I break, I'll find my pages. All right. So it activates nicotinic acetylcholine receptor sites. Now, and of course the acetylcholine is excitatory, and it activates those sites. Sodium ions flow in to the skeletal muscle. It depolarizes, fires off an action potential in the skeletal muscle, which causes it to contract. Now, if this somatic motor neuron were severed, if it was cut, would the skeletal muscles still work? No. The skeletal muscle cells are totally dependent upon the nerve supply. We had learned this before. You'd say when? For example, we talked about polio. In the polio virus, we said it destroys the somatic motor neurons, and the result is flaccid paralysis. Somebody with polio can no longer walk, and eventually they can't even breathe. So when the somatic motor neurons are destroyed, the skeletal muscles cannot work on their own without the nerve supply. Now, when a nerve is cut, severed, injured, destroyed, so the skeletal muscle has no nerve supply, that term is called denervation. If innervation means to provide a nerve supply, denervation means to take away that nerve supply, to lose it. And the result of denervation, of losing the nerve supply to the skeletal muscle, is flaccid paralysis. It can no longer contract. It will no longer work. So, because skeletal muscle is dependent upon a nerve supply to work, we say that skeletal muscle is neurogenic. You'd say, what's that mean? The nervous system generates or activates the skeletal muscle. It's neurogenic. It depends upon the nerve. It won't work without the nerve supply. All right, so I've been just reviewing somatic motor neurons, skeletal muscle. That seems all pretty simple, pretty comfortable. Let's look on the next page, page 102. And I'm even going to use a new version so we can go through this. All right, now, if the previous page 101 was a very simplified model of a somatic motor neuron controlling skeletal muscle cells, this is our simple paradigm or model of how the autonomic motor neurons innervate our internal organs, such as the heart. The heart is just an example of an internal organ. It could have been a salivary gland, it could be a stomach, it could be a gallbladder, you name it. This is just to represent any internal organ. Now, the first thing we notice is there is dual innervation. There's not just one neuron going out to the heart, there are two. So unlike skeletal muscle, which just has one somatic motor neuron going out to that skeletal muscle, this has two types of autonomic motor neurons. One of them is called a parasympathetic. The other is called the sympathetic. I'll just remind you, the difference between them functionally is that the sympathetics are activated during when? Stress! Stress. And the parasympathetic is activated during rest states. We commonly call these rest states, they're commonly known as rest and digest states, which is kind of cute. Rest and digest. Rest and digest states. So that's, and remember, again, the way they're going to work is one of them is going to act like an accelerator pedal, and the other is going to act like a brake pedal on these organs. We don't need these autonomic motor neurons for the heart to work, but their function is to speed up or slow down the rate, to modulate the rate. In fact, since I'm mentioning that you don't even need the autonomic motor neurons to make the heart work, so let's just point out then that if the autonomic motor neurons were cut to the heart, if there was denervation, loss of the nerve supply to the heart still beats. Because the heart doesn't depend upon a nerve supply, the terms that we say is we say that the heart exhibits automaticity. And so, for that matter, do all the other internal organs. They exhibit automaticity. Yeah, we've used that term already. And another word for that, we say automaticity, it works automatically, it's intrinsically active. And another word they use is myogenic, as opposed to neurogenic. It's not dependent upon a nerve supply. The heart muscle itself will fire off action potentials. Skeletal muscle cells will spontaneously, automatically fire off action potentials. They have to be activated by the somatic motor neurons, but the heart muscle cells will, on their own, fire off action potentials. They're myogenic. The muscle itself will generate the impulses or the excitation. All right. Now, what else do we notice about this? So the parasympathetics, of course, we've talked about, they come off the central nervous system at the cranial and sacral levels. The sympathetics come off the central nervous system at the thoracic and lumbar levels. We talked about that on the previous page. Now, what else do we notice? We notice that whether we're talking about a parasympathetic innervation or the sympathetic innervation, it takes two consecutive autonomic neurons to go from the central nervous system to the internal organ.
You'd say, well, how do you figure that?
Look, this is the first neuron, and it's myelinated. And if we follow it, what's it doing right here? It's synapsing onto another neuron. So in order to send a signal from the central nervous system to the heart or any other internal organ, it takes two neurons. The first one is myelinated. The second one is not myelinated. The same is true for the sympathetic. It's the same thing. Look, here's the first one. It's myelinated. And it's shown synapsing onto an unmyelinated. So again, it takes two neurons for the sympathetic signal to reach the heart. Now, if you're looking at this and thinking, it looks like here in the parasympathetic, the myelinated one's real long and the unmyelinated one's short. And here with the sympathetic, it looks like the myelinated's short and the unmyelinated's long. That's true. It is true. That is what we usually see. I don't think it's an overly important point, but more importantly, it takes first a myelinated and then an unmyelinated to reach the heart. But there is a difference usually in terms of their length. All right, now, how do we name these? How do we name these autonomic neurons? We know this is parasympathetic, this is sympathetic, but since there's a myelinated one and an unmyelinated one, how do we identify? Well, if the world was up to me, right? If I'm the king, and I know that all of you want me to be your leader, right? Probably not. Okay, it's probably a good thing. If the world was up to me, I would just call this the parasympathetic myelinated fiber, and this the parasympathetic unmyelinated. Is everybody happy on that? You like that? Unfortunately, I'm not the ruler of the world. That's not what they call them. What do we call an area where a neuron cell body is located outside the central nervous system? It's called a ganglion. Because this area is called a ganglion, this neuron is called the preganglionic fiber coming before the ganglion, and this one, which leaves the ganglion, is called the postganglionic fiber. All right? Now, so it makes sense. It certainly would be easier to just call them myelinated and unmyelinated, but the terms you need to know, because everybody else calls them preganglionic and postganglionic. The same thing is true here, preganglionic and postganglionic. Now, a little bit further. Let's say that an action potential is sent along this parasympathetic preganglionic fiber. So here's the action potential. And it's going along this preganglionic myelinated fiber, and it releases a neurotransmitter at its end. Okay, it releases a neurotransmitter. All right, the neurotransmitter that this parasympathetic preganglionic fiber releases is our old friend acetylcholine. Now, any neuron that releases acetylcholine is referred to as a cholinergic nerve fiber. Okay? So this parasympathetic myelinated preganglionic fiber is said to be cholinergic. It releases acetylcholine. Acetylcholine, we know, is usually excitatory, usually, and it excites this parasympathetic postganglionic fiber. The parasympathetic postganglionic fiber fires off an action potential, and when the action potential reaches the synaptic knobs, what does it release? Acetylcholine. So it releases acetylcholine. And what do we call any neuron that releases acetylcholine? Cholinergic. So it's cholinergic. Now, the acetylcholine that's released onto the heart will then attach to acetylcholine receptor sites on the heart. Just like acetylcholine attached and activated the acetylcholine receptor sites on skeletal muscle. But the acetylcholine receptor sites on the heart are different from the acetylcholine receptor sites on skeletal muscle. The acetylcholine receptor sites on the heart are called nicotinic acetylcholine receptor sites. I'm sorry, I said that wrong. They are called muscarinic. They're called muscarinic acetylcholine receptor sites on the heart. And if you're wondering,
Do we have to know that?
the answer is yes. Now, how do they get these, and you may say, I can't even read your writing. Okay, fine. It's saying that just made it bigger and blurrier. Okay, M-U-S-C-A-R-I-N-I-C, muscarinic. Now, how did they get that name, muscarinic and nicotinic? So, how they discovered this, in the 1940s, they actually discovered that nicotine, the same stuff that's in cigarettes, could activate the acetylcholine receptor sites on skeletal muscle, but it did not activate the acetylcholine receptor sites on the visceral organs like the heart. And then they also discovered that another chemical called muscarine.
You'd say, never heard of it.
Muscarine comes from a certain mushroom. Muscarine would activate the acetylcholine receptor sites on the heart and the stomach and these internal organs, but not activate the acetylcholine receptor sites on skeletal muscle. So they said there's a difference between the acetylcholine receptor sites on skeletal muscle and those on the internal organs like the heart. So that's the origin of those terms. Okay, let me just go a drop further and then we'll take a break. Let's look at the sympathetic. So in the case of the sympathetic, let's imagine that an action potential is sent along this sympathetic myelinated preganglionic fiber. The ganglion is right here.
You'd say, is it labeled?
Yeah, it's labeled right. Now, when it sends an action potential, it releases a neurotransmitter. What does it release? Our old friend acetylcholine. What do we call any neuron that releases acetylcholine? A cholinergic. Now, so far, the kinds of neurotransmitters involved is pretty simple. So far, acetylcholine, acetylcholine, acetylcholine. We got one last neuron. Let's see if we have a royal flush here. So that's not called a royal flush. It's called Forbicon. All right? It's not going to be. All right, so acetylcholine usually excites. It activates an action potential. Here's the action potential going along this sympathetic postganglionic fiber. And when the action potential reaches the synaptic knobs by the heart, what does it release? It releases norepinephrine. It releases norepinephrine, or Norepi for short, Norepi. Now, norepinephrine, and we've learned about it on page 61, is a catecholamine neurotransmitter. You might remember there was dopamine, norepinephrine, and epinephrine. So norepinephrine, which is also known as noradrenaline, is like an adrenaline-like chemical. Now, any neuron that releases an adrenaline-like chemical, like noradrenaline, norepinephrine, or epinephrine, adrenaline, it is referred to as an adrenergic nerve fiber. That's what it says here. Adrenergic, like the word adrenal, adrenaline. So it's releasing something like adrenaline, called noradrenaline or norepinephrine. We learned it on page 61. When that norepinephrine is released, it attaches and activates these receptor sites that both norepinephrine and epinephrine, also known as noradrenaline and adrenaline, can activate. So also on the heart, in addition to these muscarinic acetylcholine receptor sites on the heart, in addition, there are adrenergic receptor sites, adrenaline receptor sites. They're called adrenergic receptor sites. So there are two types of receptor sites on the heart cells. There is both acetylcholine receptor sites and adrenaline receptor sites. Now, this subject is going to get even more interesting and more complicated. I think more interesting. We'll stay with that word if I say complicated. We're going to be learning, and because we're going to take a break here, and then after the break, we're going to be learning not only are the acetylcholine receptor sites on the internal organs like the heart different from the acetylcholine receptor sites on the skeletal muscle, the adrenaline receptor sites on the heart are different from the adrenaline receptor sites on your airways. or on blood vessels. So we're going to be learning that we now know, and this was learned in the 1960s. 1940s, they learned about these different types of acetylcholine receptor sites. In the 1960s, they learned that there are different types of adrenaline receptor sites. Those on the heart, we're going to be learning, are called beta-1 adrenergic receptor sites. And the context that you've heard of this is you've heard of drugs called beta blockers. So we're going to learn that there are different types of adrenaline receptor sites. This subject is really important physiologically and very important pharmacologically in terms of drugs. Before we're done today, you're going to know what a beta blocker really is and what all these other types of drugs are that are commonly used for all kinds of purposes. And as you look at this picture a little bit more carefully, you will notice that it shows a solid black line followed by a dashed line. Solid black line followed by a dashed line. In every case, the solid black line represents the myelinated preganglionic fiber, and the dashed line represents the unmyelinated postganglionic fiber. And whether you write that or not, it says it right at the bottom of the picture. Does everybody see that? Right at the bottom of the page, it says that. So you'll notice that's why it indicates that there's a name for these ganglion where the parasympathetic myelinated preganglionic synapses onto the parasympathetic unmyelinated postganglionic. And I'm not asking you to remember these ganglion. Future dental hygienists will be asked to learn the name of these ganglion in your head and neck anatomy class. So you'll notice this is called the ciliary ganglion, and the two that are relevant, especially in dental hygiene, again, I'm not going to test you on this, is we know that in the cranial nerve number 7 and 9, there are parasympathetic autonomic motor neurons that innervate the salivary glands. And the cranial nerve number 7 contains parasympathetics that go to, let's say, number line, let me do 9. 9, glossopharyngeal. It synapses in an area called the otic ganglion. What does oto mean? Ear. It's near the ear, and it innervates the parotid salivary gland. Now again, I'm not testing you on that. I'm just giving you a heads up of what they're going to ask you to learn in your head and neck anatomy class in dental hygiene. And the cranial nerve number 7 has parasympathetic preganglionic fibers that synapse in the sphenopalatine and submandibular ganglion that then go on out to supply the sublingual and submandibular salivary glands. Because the salivary gland innervation and salivation is one of the most important aspects of good oral health and reducing tooth decay, dental caries. So you will learn a lot about salivation and the control of salivation. Anyhow, we know that the vagus nerve is very, very important, pardon me, because it contains literally hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of parasympathetic autonomic motor neurons that go out to all of the internal organs of your chest and abdomen. So you'll notice branching off the vagus nerve, pardon me, are myelinated preganglionic fibers, and they are shown synapsing onto very short unmyelinated postganglionic fibers right near the visceral organs. So you can see that in general, the myelinated preganglionic fiber is long, and the unmyelinated postganglionic fiber is short. That's why we showed you on page 102, the myelinated preganglionic is long, and the unmyelinated postganglionic is short. That's what it's showing here. One more thing I want to show you on this picture here on page 97. It shows that there's a parasympathetic innervation, to your heart, to the liver, to the stomach, to the kidney. What's this little thing right here? That's the adrenal gland. According to this diagram, is there a parasympathetic innervation to the adrenal? No, there's not. All right, you say, okay, so what? We'll come to so what. Let's look on the next page, page 98.